everyone, how's it going? I've been taking bites into the gaming scene as of late, finding either shorter or replayable experiences that I can digest before someone makes a comment. When you hear the term bite-sized, people usually think of two things. One is either small storage or something that is quick to pick up and play at the drop of a dime. Both are correct, but it's a more complicated topic now thanks to the many genres that exist today, and games big and small have been able to accommodate for smaller windows of time that some people in the world have. Bite-sized games are either really short or near infinite with replayability, and no matter how much time you spend on the experience, you're already getting everything out of what the game offers, even if your play session is like 5 to 10 minutes or something. Both single player and multiplayer experiences have bite-sized experiences, but have different dynamics that can influence your time spent on them. Single player has you pick up and play without any pressure for the most part, whereas with multiplayer it's the opposite because it's always evolving as long as there are players in the game. Multiplayer games, like I said, evolve through player experience over time. Fortnite is no longer what it used to be in 2018, but you still get a bite-sized package in each play session, and when you don't have a lot of time to pick it up and play, it can be pretty daunting in other experiences, like say Crusader Kings 2 or something. Games like Fortnite do still play in the confines of a bite-sized experience because of everything you're getting out of it, and I'll explain the rest later on. In any event, I'll be listing a number of points that I think will guide you on how to make your bite-sized experience replayable no matter its size and scale. Now, let's get into it. All games have varying degrees of skill, but some have a point where you can't go any further and there's not much to ascertain from it. Walking simulators or narrative-driven stories are more relaxed in comparison to games that require constant player input. Multiplayer games have the advantage of being dynamic in their skill ceiling, and it can take an immeasurably long time to get to a point where you feel like you've mastered the experience, which not a lot of people have. Pros in the Rocket League scene or Counter-Strike have spent years and some decades worth of hours mastering their chosen game, and even then, they're still always climbing the infinite peak where the ceiling continues to increase. And this is because of the crescendo of different players and their levels of skill evolving the game over time. Single player games do of course have this as well to a certain point, but there is an eventual cap. Even games like Doom Eternal and Ultra Kill will reach a plateau in their own respective skill ceiling where there's not much room left to go. Mastering a bite-sized game requires a consistent pattern of challenges that mirrors the player's developing skill, starting off with being manageable to being really hard later on, because by that point you should already have a good basis on the game mechanics. Tetris has been around for eons and people are still constantly pushing its boundaries and has everything already presented to you in order to improve. More complex games will require more time and effort, but said bite-sized experiences should already give you an enjoyable template that inspires improvement. Look at Super Hexagon, a minimalistic game with a dynamic progression system that always keeps you on guard for its challenges. It's a game so relatively simple in its design that you can pick it up and play for a few minutes. And remember, the desire to master a game only materializes when the player is actually enjoying the game. Otherwise, there's no point in playing at all. If your game isn't even fun in the moment that you start playing the game, you've done something wrong. Pick up and play games need to have a gentle introduction and a welcoming party for the player, where it's simple enough to return to every once in a while. Larger scale games, like say Crusader Kings 2, are much harder because you have so many mechanics and features that get introduced later that you need to understand, and it can be incredibly overwhelming. Besides the differences in the genres of games like Super Hexagon or Crusader Kings 2, they both have accessible avenues for quick enjoyment. You don't need to engage with every single mechanic in Crusader Kings 2, and you can set it up in a way to have a more streamlined experience with more accessible goals to dip in and out of. But this only works if you are enjoying the learning process and don't mind the grand scale of the game. Grand strategy games are not really what people would consider to be bite-sized games, but you can have bite-sized goals. And here's another thing about grand strategy games in general. Their experiences last as long as you wanted to, and they are open-ended. There's no beginning and end point in between, and they don't need to be progressed in the same way as a story-driven experience. You can pick it up, drop it, come back to it later, and if you've missed out on anything, you can always revisit it in another session. It's not the end of the world. But for the sake of an easier example, let's return to Super Hexagon. All you have to do is protect your triangle from the incoming objects. It's manageable at first, but it gets more unforgiving over time. Anyone can pick this game up and play it on their lunch break. Would they be able to beat it in that span of time? Doesn't really matter because the game already gives you everything from the get-go and has a simple control scheme with challenging progression. Accessibility also ties in with the desire to master the game, which again only works when you're actually enjoying the game in the first place. Make sure your game is easy to get into first before adding in more bells and whistles. There are a lot of games out there that feel like one and done experiences. Some may choose to replay it to make different choices during the game, but beyond that, there's not much of a reason to replay once you've exhausted everything. This is especially the case in more story-driven games like Firewatch, where the only reason to replay that game is for the dialogue options. While this is fine for story-based games, bite-sized experiences need to have functions and mechanics in place to incentivize continuous playthroughs, where you can not only play it for as long as you want, but each time will also be a unique experience compared to your last playthrough. The best genres I've seen do this in an accessible format is in the roguelike genre. It's a genre that's well known for their utilization of RNG and procedural generation that makes up the unique playthroughs people have. Say if you die in a run of Spelunky or The Binding of Isaac, the next run will be different because of the different templates used for the levels, as well as the placements of enemies and items. It won't be a static experience where everything is in place like it was before, but something new and familiar. Vampire Survivors and other bullet heaven games have different playthroughs in the use of different characters and item builds, so each reattempt is always an opportunity to try something else. And even when the experience is new, you still have the pick up and play nature of its gameplay where you're not necessarily overwhelmed because they usually ease you in before the difficulty intensifies. This is important for people who are rusty and need some time to readjust. This is an advantage roguelike games have in the beginning because the player will get the main gameplay loop still and not necessarily miss out on anything besides content. You can do a 10-minute session of Nuclear Throne or The Binding of Isaac and still get somewhere. You can't do that at all in games like Baldur's Gate 3 because of the amount of commitment required. Games like that are made to be played leisurely when you have chunks of time to spare, but games like The Binding of Isaac are flexible with time where you can still get the same experience whether it's for a couple of minutes or for a couple of hours. If you're on the go a lot and are always busy, that's okay because it provides enough for you to still enjoy in small bursts through its unique playthroughs that are always different, making it dynamic and not static, and also just giving you a lot of progression in a short span of time. Make a game change in each playthrough, whether it's through mutators, difficulty modifiers, or clever use of RNG and procedural generation. One great example is Tiny Rogues, a game that looks simple on the surface but has a lot of depth underneath it. Also, for additional notes, look at incorporating New Game Plus where everything is remixed for new and interesting challenges. Dark Souls 2 is a good example of this. And one more additional note on this point is in different game modes. You can have modes that offer the same gameplay experience but different rules set in place. Take a game called Force Reboot for instance, a game where you rush from room to room as quick as possible while killing each enemy before your health runs out. Alternatively, there are other modes like Endless Mode, Rush Mode where there are different variables. One has you going for as long as you can and the other is getting to the rooms as fast as possible, like a speedrun. Then there's the Arena Mode, where it operates on the same health loss mechanic, but has it all in one large room. Killing all the enemies gives all of your health back and the cycle repeats. So think of other ways to remix your gameplay loop in the guise of different game modes and modifiers or mutators or what have you. This point also coincides with mastery and accessibility. The most important thing to consider is having a nice welcome before overwhelming the player with brutal difficulty spikes. Take Chopped Goblins for instance, a micro shooter developed by David Szymanski, the same guy who created Dusk, Iron Lung and Squirrel Stapler, and the upcoming Butcher's Creek, a game inspired by Condemned Criminal Origins. Cannot fucking wait. That revolves around you dealing with a goblin invasion spanned across 5 levels. The first level has you against 2 different enemies, and each level afterwards slowly introduces more enemy types, and by the end the game is throwing everything at you. But is this an issue? No, because by the time you've reached the final level, you already have a good grasp on how the game works. Its simple gameplay makes it a fun pick up and play experience that also has some challenging moments, and sometimes you may end up dying if you're not careful. But because of how short the experience is, it doesn't take long to get back to where you were before. Take another micro shooter game called Reverend, developed by Twisted Sickle and Dosman Games, that uses the Easy FPS Editor, an accessible game engine for people that want to make their own retro shooter without knowing a lick of code. This game also follows the same principle as Chopped Goblins. Slowly introduce the challenges over each level, giving the player room to get familiar with the controls and the mechanics in place. Reverend offers a more streamlined and simpler experience that's made as it is. I would recommend checking it out. It's only $4.50 at least in Australian dollars, but even then it's still a can of Coke for a lot of other people in other places, I'm assuming anyways. But definitely check this game out, especially if you're already familiar with my easy FPS editor video, which I would also recommend checking out, and I'll put a link for it in the description. But Chopped Goblins has more to offer in terms of modifying your difficulty mode, with 4 different modes that each have their own variables in place. The difficulty progression is still the same, but the variables included in each difficulty mode is what will impact your experience and possibly make it more challenging. Most people will start on a normal experience since it's their first time, and then will go to the harder difficulties if they want the same experience but more challenging. A lot of games follow the path of guided progression systems, but some will offer more customization for the player, which is where games like Geometry Arena or Geometry Dash come in. One comes with a number of options and modifiers to customize your play session, while the other provides an infinite pool of levels made by the community that go from simple to masochistic. Both games are bite-sized and are dynamic in their difficulty control, so when you make a difficult game, also give the players freedom and means to curate their own challenges, whether it be through mutators or difficulty selections or custom content, as well as other things that sort of mesh together. And if you're making a bite-sized Souls-like, then make a rite of passage approach, where if you overcome the current boss, that's like a skill check, you're then ready to face more challenges if you succeed in that skill check. But do not make a game hard for the sake of it, because it never equates to being good. A game should operate on the challenging but fair approach first, before allowing room for more masochistic avenues. Whether it's through unlockables, cosmetics, high scores, and leaderboards, having a reward system can add additional reasons for a player to continue playing the simplest of games over and over again. Even something like Flow Free can offer rewards in the guise of achievements, and a lot of these achievements present ready-made goals for the player to strive for. While it's not necessarily a requirement, you could still have other means of giving the player something in return. Multiplayer games already do this with ranks, battle passes, or daily, weekly challenges with rewards and XP and other things. They're designed to keep players hooked in, making for an infinite cycle of reward progression and continuous playtime. Single player though, it becomes more important to have some sort of reward system if you want returning players. The Souls games do this by rewarding exploration or by killing enemies that give XP, which then enables the player to upgrade their characters with levels, which allows them to use better gear that they find in the world that makes the run easier. Or in tower defense games like Plants vs Zombies, the currency that you earn in game gives you access to upgrades that can give you an advantage in the level, and each level that you complete gives you access to more plants, increasing the challenge but equally rewarding the player with more access to the game. Players need to have a sense of progression and feel like that they're getting somewhere, and reward systems can be a motivating force behind the wheel to gear the player towards that direction. Roguelike games do this with permanent unlocks between each run, where even if you die, you get access to new items or characters for either easier runs or more exciting ones, as well as more content. If the only reward is experience, or just fun, then that is something that can only be appreciated if the game actually is fun for the player in the first place. Careful with daily tasks though, because you don't want to add a FOMO effect to your game unless your intention is to get people addicted like in Destiny 2. Make it another reason to play the game, but don't make it super important. Give players rewards equivalent to what daily tasks offer. That way people can take their time and still earn worthwhile rewards leisurely. As for leaderboards and high scores, they are good to have in your games, but they're only worthwhile for people trying to beat their own scores or people that are dedicated to that game. So don't make it your only reward system. Daily, weekly tasks, achievements, in-game currency for unlocks, or as well as access to more content, work much better for more casual players that dip in and out from time to time, so keep that in mind. And that's all I have for this take. Bite-sized gaming is a flexible term because it boils down to how much you get in a short span of time, not so much how big or short the game is. Fortnite is a bite-sized experience because you can duck in, do a match where you either win or die. If you win, great. If you don't, you just move on to the next game immediately. And all of this happens, on average, is about 20 minutes or so, or slightly over, and usually less if you end up dying sooner. In that span of time, you still get everything the game has to offer on the table, in less time than your meal breaks during work. Games like Counter-Strike or League or Dota are not really bite-sized because they often require longer periods of commitment in a team-based environment, and leaving due to time constraints often penalizes the player for doing so. And while there are other modes, they're not exactly reflective of the intended experience, an experience that requires a lot more time and commitment. They're games to be played when you have uninterrupted time, unless you're playing custom or casual game modes, but like I already said, those are modes that aren't necessarily reflective of the main game mode that those games provide. Bite size just means something you can duck in and out of and still get the complete experience. In a lot of battle royale games, you can just leave if things don't work out. Same goes for more custom-based multiplayer experiences. Single player though, the issue of penalties for leaving doesn't really exist other than losing some progress, or in roguelikes where you lose your run. Bite-sized gaming, again, isn't really about how big the game is or the install size, but how much it can offer you, even if it's only for a couple of minutes. Content can be short or big, but progression needs to be consistent and fairly attainable to motivate the player further. So even if you can only spare a couple of minutes, you can still get some results out of that. And that's what bite-sized games should strive for. Don't get overwhelmed by the scale or the size of the game's content pool. Don't bury the player with mechanics from the beginning. Give the player something they can pick up and play and come back into whenever they want. If anyone else has any other insights or points to make, whether you agree or disagree, feel free to share in the comments section. Best of luck.